Hey everyone, Royal here from Isle of Wight Victim Witness. Really excited to chat with you guys today because we are going to dispel some myths about strangulation. So the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention provided us with a great PSA that inspired us to make this video. So they sent us the top 5 myths of strangulation, as well as some facts and evidence to back up those facts that dispel the myths. So we are going to walk through these myths and we're going to hopefully educate you guys on strangulation, and you guys are going to be able to go forward and educate others. So as a note, strangulation in Virginia is a Class 6 felony, and so clearly the state has recognized that strangulation is a very serious crime. It's a very serious action. We'll get into that a little bit more in down the road, probably in about 5-10 minutes from now. But if you want to look up the actual definition of strangulation in the state of Virginia, as well as what the penalty is for it, you can go to the Virginia Code online and you can look up 18.2-51.6, and then you'll be able to find what the state of Virginia has defined strangulation as. So let's go ahead and get started and bust some of these myths. Myth number 1, strangulation and choking are the same thing. Spoiler alert, they are not. That's why it's a myth. So choking is an internal obstruction of an airway by a foreign object. So if you've seen Mrs. Doubtfire, you know the infamous climatic scene where Pierce Brosnan is choking on a piece of seafood, and Robin Williams' character, Mrs. Doubtfire, rushes over and does the Heimlich, saves him, but in the process destroys his disguise. And so the reason why I brought that up is because it's a really good visual to show what choking is, right? There was a foreign object lodged inside of an individual's airway that was preventing them from being able to breathe. As to where strangulation is the external application of pressure by a foreign object, which can be fingers, feet, knees, rope, things like that, with the intention of impeding blood flow to the brain, right? Impeding the ability for the brain to get oxygen. It's very important to make that distinction because a lot of times survivors will come in and they will say, oh, person B choked me. When in reality, what should be said or described is person B put their hands on my throat, squeezed, and it was difficult to breathe. And the reason why I bring that up as well and kind of made the description a little bit longer than just, oh, he choked me or, oh, he strangled me, is because a survivor's role is to come into court and to explain what happened, is to describe the incident for the judge to come up with a conclusion. A conclusion is that a survivor was strangled or a survivor was assaulted or, something happened to a survivor. It's a judge's job to come in and say, okay, person A described that person B put their hands on their throat, squeezed, and it was difficult for person A to breathe. Therefore, person B has committed strangulation and is guilty of strangulation. Because a lot of times what happens is that survivors come in and they're very disappointed when they testify that they were choked or they were strangled, but the judge decides that that's not what happened. And a lot of times prosecutors, it's their role to come in and ask clarifying questions, things like that. But before we go down the rabbit hole too much about what a trial is, and I end up giving legal advice that I'm not trying to give, it's just important to understand the distinction between those and what can ultimately happen, what the outcome can be if you give conclusions rather than descriptions. And it kind of leads us into myth number 2, right? That strangulation always leaves visible injuries. The Strangulation Training Institute does provide us with a really cool example that has where individuals will put their fingers around their wrist and sort of release or hold the pressure because it shows that it doesn't always leave marks, right? You're still putting pressure, but it doesn't leave marks. I like to use the elastic hair tie on my wrist example. So I've had my elastic on my wrist for pretty much the whole day, and it doesn't hurt me, it doesn't hurt being on my wrist, but when I move it down, you can see that there's like an indentation here on my wrist. And if it's a brand new hair tie that's super tight, hasn't been stretched out, the first few hours that it's on my wrist, it can actually hurt, right? It can be uncomfortable. And so when I move the elastic, when I move the hair tie, it releases that pressure. And I can actually feel that pressure being released. So it's really important to know how strangulation, like what that pressure, how it works, because over half of strangulation survivors don't have any physical injuries. And a lot of intimate partner violence organizations will educate the public and remind everybody that, bruising doesn't show up right away. A lot of these marks, they don't show up right away. And so responding officers can't just show up to a scene and expect to be able to see physical, visible injuries of how strangulation has affected an individual. And that sort of leads us into myth number 3, which is that if the survivor or victim can make noise, so speak or scream or breathe, then they are not being strangled. It goes right back to what we just discussed, right? Just because somebody has put pressure doesn't mean that there's going to be an automatic injury. All that matters is that pressure was applied by an external object with the intention of blood flow to the brain being blocked. That's all that matters. A person can actually have complete obstruction and still be able to breathe from have complete obstruction from an external force and still be able to breathe up until the moment that they die from a lack of oxygen. And so because of that, it's really important to understand, like I said, all that matters is whether or not external pressure was applied. That leads us into myth number 4, that strangulation can't actually be harmful because there's a lot of professional groups that use it, right? Martial artists, law enforcement, the military. Those groups are trained and should be trained, if they haven't been, from moment number 1, that using any type of strangulation techniques are lethal and that they come with serious risks. There are numerous incidents of accidental deaths that have happened at sporting events or trainings because people have incorrectly done their strangulation techniques, right? They have incorrectly learned them, or they are learning them and they're not executing them properly. And so because it is a lethal form of force and it's a combat technique, when they do it incorrectly or they do it for too long, it can seriously harm other individuals. And so when we recognize that, it makes it much easier for us as the general public to understand how strangulation can impact, right? How the act of putting our hands or another part of our body onto somebody's throat to stop them from being able to breathe can actually affect them. So that leads us to myth number 5, which is probably one of the most important and the one that actually has the most technical background to it. So I'm going to explain this one a little bit more in depth. So it's that strangulation victims and survivors should be able to detail their attack. We are going to talk about the brain for a little bit. So all of you psychology majors or people who are really into learning about the mind, you're going to get really excited because I'm going to throw some technical terminology at you. So at this point, pretty much the entire general public should be aware of the fact that trauma can affect the brain's ability to store memory, but that it also impacts individuals differently. So the part of the brain that is responsible for memory storage, it's called the hippocampus. Sounds like hippopotamus. If you call it the hippopotamus, you're not alone because I do that too. But it is, like I said, the part of the brain that handles memory storage. But ironically, it is also the part of the brain that is most susceptible to oxygen deprivation. So let's kind of walk through that for a little bit. If you know anything about the brain or you have a very logical mind, you've probably already come to the conclusion that I'm about to discuss. Let's use the example of your phone. So when your phone's battery drops low and it goes into low power mode, what happens? You aren't able to play videos, it doesn't do autoplay for your videos. Photos load a lot slower. And it's also probably a little bit more difficult to stream Netflix, Hulu, or Spotify or Pandora, right? Any music or video. And the reason why is because your phone's battery has to say, I'm going to stop giving function to these particular parts. So that way the other parts of the phone, which are more important, like being able to text or call or send emails, are still able to operate on their maximum optimization. The brain does the same thing. The hippocampus, when it's got a very low amount of oxygen coming to it, turns around and says, I'm going to stop working, I'm going to stop storing memory, so that way the other parts of the body and the brain can continue to function. So when we recognize that, when we understand how that happens, right, that the hippocampus is going to shut down, it makes sense as to why survivors are then going to be unable to remember a lot of other things. Because it's the same thing, right, when your phone is charging. When you plug it into the charger, if it's on low power mode, it just doesn't automatically go into sufficient mode, right? It doesn't go from yellow to green. It stays in yellow until it hits about 80%, and then you get a notification that says, phone charged sufficiently or whatever. The reason why is because your phone has to get enough battery juice back in order to be able to operate at its full function, to be able to operate sufficiently. The hippocampus is the same way, right? You have to have that pressure release long enough so that way full oxygen is getting back to your brain with enough time that the hippocampus can say, great, I've got enough battery juice, I can start to store memory again. If you're not able to do that, right, if your hippocampus isn't able to do that, it makes total sense why survivors are able to call the police, go to the hospital, file a report, talk to people, have pressure released from their throat, and not remember any of it. Because the hippocampus hasn't reached its 80% or whatever the level of the hippocampus, whatever percentage it needs to start operating at 100% again. So when we recognize that, when we know that, then when survivors come into court and they tell a judge, I do not recall giving that statement to a nurse at the hospital. I do not recall what my surroundings were when I got into the ambulance. I don't recall that. I don't recall whether or not I was on oxygen. I don't recall when I left the hospital. There's so many things that a survivor can say that they don't remember, they don't recall, because the hippocampus wasn't working yet. Because if they were strangled, right, and it doesn't just matter about the force, all that matters is the prolonged, right, it just matters that there was external pressure being applied. The longer that pressure is applied, or the more forcefully, the faster the hippocampus loses its ability to do what it's supposed to do. And that's why it's so important to understand how the brain works. It's so important to understand the neurobiology of trauma, because when we start to have these explanations, some of these phenomenons that don't seem to have an explanation or didn't seem to have one for 30, 40 years, all of a sudden have an explanation. And so as judges, it's very important for judges to make the distinction that 40 years ago when they were in law school, they didn't know anything about how trauma affected the brain like that. But the second that they're in a training and they find out, hold up, there's this part of the brain that's responsible for memory storage, and ironically, it's the fastest part of the brain that loses its ability to do that when there's no oxygen to it. Now they're able to come into court and they're able to say, okay, it makes sense as to why this person doesn't remember this or that, because their hippocampus stopped working. That's why it's also important for law enforcement to know that too, and advocates and prosecutors, because then we're able to, prosecutors especially, they're able to go in and they're able to address that. They're able to pull an expert witness in from, the neurobiology field and ask those questions, so that then everybody else, the jury or the judge or anybody else who's there can then understand what happens to the brain. So we hope that you learned something. We hope that this was really informational and educational for you. And we hope that you've been inspired to share this information with others too. It's really important that we bust myths and that we give better access to education and information so that the general public can be more aware and can start to live healthier and better lives. And that we can ultimately make our communities safer. Because when we understand, we can make progress. Because knowledge is power, right? So if you learned something from this video, please share it, right? Please share it on social, please email it to people, please text it to people. We really want everyone to know these myths and to share them with the world and dispel them as quickly as possible. If you have questions, please feel free to, add a comment or send us a message. We would love to direct you in towards resources that are credible and provide accurate information that can provide updated statistics and information for you to get some more answers to your questions. And then if you have questions about Isle of Wight Victim Witness Services, what we do, how you can get involved with us, please let us know. We would love to chat with you about that.